Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning I'm going to continue talking about the Fukanzazengi. This is talk number 6. So Dogen is now moving into different territory, and he's starting to talk about some kind of history of in the Fukanzazengi. And he says, let's see. So the last time I talked about, I speak of as not learning meditation as simply the dormant gate of repose and bliss, the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment, etc. And then he kind of switches gear and he says, in surveying the past, so that's where we are. He says, in surveying the past, we find that transcendence of both unenlightenment and enlightenment and dying while either sitting or standing have all depended entirely on the strength of Zazen. Okay, so let's break this down, see what he's talking about here. Transcendence of both unenlightenment and enlightenment. So he's talking about going beyond both delusion and realization as being dependent upon Zazen. In other words, not thinking about Zazen as some kind of goal, that you're going to become enlightened or you're going to transcend delusion. Our definition of Zazen is being fully present for each moment's arising and the need. So from Zazen we say, how do we respond? And we can't respond skillfully if our response is hindered by judging whether or not we think our response is an enlightened response or whether we think our response is a delusional response at the time. So this way we're always trying to parse our experience and double think what we're doing. And we kind of, at that point, we become kind of paralyzed in our practice because we're, constantly second guessing ourselves. So he says, this ability to respond is not based on some kind of criteria called enlightenment or unenlightened. Like maybe you can go back and look at your experience and say, the way I like to think of it is I say, was I skillful or unskillful? Was this workable or not very workable? Because enlightenment and delusion are kind of loaded words. So this way in which I just ask myself, in retrospect or even maybe at the time, because if you're looking at somebody while you're talking to them, you can see maybe what you're saying is upsetting them or whatever, and so you might say, okay, this maybe what I'm doing right now isn't working very well. Maybe I should try something else. Even ask that person what's going on. So he says, in surveying the past, we find the transcendence of both unenlightenment and enlightenment have all depended entirely on the strength of Zazen. So this response that comes from really being present doesn't mean, he's not saying that we can skip being reflective of our experience, but and we can't reject what we're perceiving as our delusion. And actually, to reject our delusional thinking in a way is pursuing unenlightenment. So what I mean by that is, if you're constantly saying to yourself, I have to be enlightened, I have to be enlightened, my experiences have to be enlightened, therefore I cannot acknowledge my experience as being delusion, it means that you never have a chance to actually examine what it is that you're doing that's not very workable, because you can't accept the fact that what you're doing is not very workable, because you're beating yourself up for not being enlightened. So I would say this is actually pursuing unenlightenment, and because we're just compounding the problem. Genjo Koan Dogen says, those who are greatly enlightened about delusion are Buddhas. Those who are caught in delusion while in realization are sentient beings. He says, so this being aware and enlightened about the nature of delusion is how we wake up. Because if we aren't aware of and able to actually investigate and accept and transform what we're doing that's unskillful or unworkable, then how are we going to know about delusion? How are we going to be greatly enlightened about delusion? So those who are greatly enlightened about delusion are Buddhas. So we cannot reject our delusion. We can transform it. We can say that wasn't very helpful, but we don't need to reject it as being some kind of horrible thing. And then the literal translation of this is interesting to me, because what the unenlightened and the enlightened section here, what is being translated as unenlightened is Bon, B-O-N, which basically means a common person. So then what's being translated as enlightened is Osho, or an extraordinary person. So knowing Bon and Osho is actually a nice segue into the second part of what Dogen's talking about here. He says the part about dying while either sitting or standing. So, this is kind of sometimes used as sort of benchmark in these stories about Zen masters. So theoretically, Bodhidharma died sitting in Zazen posture, and Huineng, the sixth ancestor, died while sitting in the Zazen posture. So Dogen says, dying while either sitting or standing have all depended entirely on the strength of Zazen. So I'm going to go back to the part about sitting or standing, but first I want to talk about this line about all depended entirely on the strength of Zazen. So if you look up the Japanese for strength, that's being translated as strength here by Shoako Gomora, is ichinen. And ichinen actually has a connection with faith, having faith in your Zazen. So our ability to make an extraordinary effort to stay awake during 20 minutes of Zazen, which sometimes can feel like an extraordinary effort. So is this effort that we're making, this faith that we're making, that we can actually do this practice. So having this faith, he says, it's dependent upon the strength of our faith in this practice. So I think that's one of the things that he's pointing to here when he says this have all depended on the strength or on the faith of our Zazen, the faith we have in our practice. And so I encourage us all to have faith in our Zazen practice, to just follow the instructions of keep coming back. So we don't have to ask ourselves, am I doing this to become enlightened? Am I doing this, to get rid of delusion or something like that? Really the question is, am I coming back to the present moment? When we're sitting Zazen, that's all we need to do. And when we're talking to other people, that's actually all we need to do too. But that's often very difficult. So, you'll be talking to somebody if you notice that maybe you're already thinking of the answer, that, you're now got the topic down, but your mind is racing ahead and going, oh, I know what the answer, what I'm going to say in response to this before the person has even finished their sentence. So that's an example of not being in the present moment. It's an example of not really just disciplining yourself to just stay with the conversation as it is at that moment. Okay, returning to the phrase dying while either sitting or standing, there is a text called, in English, Records of the Transmission of the Lamp, that was written in something like 1003 or 1011, something like that, about, at least more than 100 years before Dogen was born. And anyway, Dogen was very familiar with this text, and it is the kind of root text for lots of koans and Zen stories. So there's an English translation out by a guy named Randolph Whitfield. So I was going through the English translation looking for examples of people who died standing up or sitting. And I found this kind of wonderful story, which I wanted to share with you. So this is about a Zen master who died standing on his head. So the story goes like this. About to reveal his cessation in front of the diamond cave. In other words, he's about to reveal to his followers that he is going to die. Zen Master Yingfeng of Wutai Mountain, he asked the assembly, everywhere those about to go into change, or everywhere those who are about to die, go sitting or lying. I have seen this. Is there anyone who passed away standing? So that's what he asked his students. Have you seen anyone who passed away standing? And the assembly said, well, yes, actually, we have. He says, they said there was. And then, so the teacher said, was there anyone who passed away standing upside down? That's what the master asked his assembly. No, they said, such has never been seen. So at that point, the master went into his transformation standing upside down. But his robe still covered his body appropriately. When the assembly was planning for the cremation, the body was immovable as a mountain peak. People came from far and wide to gaze at it. There was no end to their wonder. Well, can you imagine why not? The master had a younger sister who was a nun. Being in the vicinity, she came and made prostrations. And then she scolded him and she said, elder brother, since of old never obeying the law of the Dharma, and in death confusing people even more. And then she gave him a push. And he fell flat on the ground. After he was cremated, the ashes were put in a pagoda. I'm like down with a sister, right? She's great. So I'm not sure this is a testimony to the greatness of the Zen master that he was able to die standing on his head. All right, so that's kind of a funny story that I found there about that. So that's an example of dying in an extraordinary position. That comes about, I suppose, from the strength of your practice. But Dogen does say I didn't give you this quote, but he says in a Jinzu, mystical power, which is a fast school in Shobogenzo, Dogen said, mystical power's embodiment is 3,000 acts in the morning and 800 acts in the evening. So the meaning of this 3,000 acts in the morning and 800 acts in the evening refers to the effort put into practice. It refers to this daily effort that we put into our practice. So for him, Dogen, that's where the strength and the mystical powers come from. So then the next part of this text is, in addition, the bringing about of enlightenment by the opportunity provided by a finger, a banner, a mallet, a needle, and the effecting of realization with the aid of a hosu, a fist, a staff, or a shout, cannot be fully understood by discriminative thinking. Indeed, it cannot be fully known by the practicing or realizing of supernatural powers either. Okay, so what is all of this? The part about the effort of the finger, a banner, a needle, a mallet, hosu, fist, a staff, or a shout. So I thought I would talk about what those different things are. And the first one was the finger, which refers to Chan Master Jujui, whose name is Gute in Japanese. And he woke up when his master, Qianlong, Tenryu in Japanese, held up one finger. So this is called one finger Zen, very famous Zen master. Gute continued his master's practice by also holding up one finger. So he would do this at the appropriate time. So what was being communicated by this holding up of one finger? Dogen refers to this story several times in the Shobogenzo, and he refers to it in a fascicle called Baika, which means plum blossoms. Dogen said, at the time of this one blossom, there are 3 blossoms, 4 blossoms, 5 blossoms. There are 100 blossoms, 1,000 blossoms, 10,000 blossoms, 100,000 blossoms, until there are countless blossoms. The Ubadara flower and the Utpala flower and the like are all one finger or 2 fingers of the old plum blossoms. So this one finger represents the totality of everything, as we say, the 100,000 grasses manifesting. So it says everything is all, he says everything is all right here at this moment. So if we saw someone hold up a finger like this, do we think that we would have an enlightened moment or an insight? Well, maybe not. I mean, I'm holding up a finger right now. But the thing about it is that holding up the one finger really depends upon Guite's ability to suss out whether his student is at that right place where holding up a finger was going to make a difference. So one finger or two fingers or 100 fingers is to just wake up to things just as they are right now. Now, the reference to a banner refers to a story about the sixth patriarch, the sixth ancestor, Hui Ning. So Hui Ning, as the story goes, was responding to two monks who were arguing about whether the wind was moving or the banner or the flag was moving. Now the story if you know this story, how many of you have heard this story about Hui Ning? Okay, so I thought it was interesting that it's a little different in the transmission of the lamp records. So the way the story goes here is that there was a monk named Yin Zhang expounding on the Buddhist sutras. And then one day during his lecture, a storm came up. And seeing the banner waving in the wind, he asked his audience, he said, "Is the wind moving or the flag moving?" And someone said, "The wind is moving." Someone else said, "Nope, the flag is moving." So these two people held fast to their viewpoints. Usually we hear about just two monks arguing about, what it is, the flag or the wind. So Yin Zhang, he didn't know how to decide himself what the right answer to this was. So he deferred to Hui Ning, who happened to be standing in the assembly. And Hui Ning said, "Neither the wind nor the flag is moving." And Yi Zhang said, "Then what is it that is moving?" And Hui Ning said, "Your mind is moving." So that part is probably what we've all heard. So there are actually a few ways to understand this koan, and maybe more than I'm going to offer you. Hui Ning, one kind of common way of talking about it is say, Hui Ning said, "Well, you guys are arguing and you're caught in delusion about is it this or that?" And then he says, "It's your mind moving." So in that way, he's saying you've lost your equanimity. You no longer have a stable mind because you're arguing with each other. So you're trying to answer an intellectual question, and this does not require an intellectual answer. The other thing he might be doing is making a negative comment about Yin Zhang's teaching, because it says here that Yin Zhang was expounding on the Zen Sutras. So in our sort of Zen parlance, teachers traditionally who expound on the sutras, like that's their whole gig. They just go around, they expound, they give lectures about sutras, and that's their kind of stock and trade and what they do, and that's not considered to be in Zen to be exactly advanced practice. So it's kind of intellectualization, so he might be saying something about that. It's your mind that's moving. Now, another interpretation of this would be is to look at it from Dogen's point of view, and that is that the mind refers to all of reality's functioning. So the mind for Dogen is when we say the mind, we're not talking about this mind, we're talking about the mind of all of the universe. And that mind is not like some kind of God figure that is watching down, making intellectual or sort of making things happen kind of mind, but it is the mind of all of everything functioning together, all the causes and conditions, all the causal functioning of the world's happening is a kind of mind of the world working. So he says in Hotsu Bodaishin, which is bringing forth the mind of Bodhi, he says, mind here is mind like it is. Mind here is mind like it is. It is the mind of all the whole earth. Therefore, it is the mind of self and other. So if Hui Ning is saying it is that mind, it is the mind of the whole world functioning. That is also your mind. It's the mind, if you will, of the flag. It's the mind, if you will, of the breeze. It is the totality of everything's happening in that moment. All the people who are there, Hui Ning, the monks who were arguing, the teacher, everything's happening. And that is when he says, it is your mind that's moving. It is this mind that is the reality functioning at that moment. It is a kind of dynamism of all of reality functioning. So that he's referring to that. What about a needle? Sometimes Zazen is referred to the acupuncture needle. So this way in which we seated meditation. Dogen wrote another fascicle called Zazen Shin, which means lancet or needle of seated meditation. And he wrote about that needle, he said, it is the manifestation of the great function. What's a mallet? A mallet is a wooden hammer that's used to strike a board. Or in the Zendo, we have something called a sui ching, which is a kind of wooden pedestal, and there's a little piece on the top of it, and you go around and bang when you're making an announcement in the Zendo. But in some Zendos, they actually use a mallet on a board as opposed to this little kind of piece that's banged on the top of the pillar. So that's a kind of ceremony or announcing something. So that is this idea of the mallet. Hosu's a fly whisk, and there's a little story that Dogen tells about Ru Jing concerning the fly whisk. Janko and I have these whisks. We don't use them very often, but they're a wooden handle with nowadays they're synthetic hair, but back in the day they were actually horsehair, so pretty heavy. Anyway, the story goes, so this is a quote from, where did I find this? Well, unfortunately I didn't write down where it's from. Dogen said, this episode was raised by my former master of the old Buddha, was abbot of Mount Tiantong. A donor visited the monastery, they made a donation, and then in response to the donation, to cultivate merit, the assembly read sutras, and then it was requested of Ru Jing that he mount the teaching seat. So my former master got on the teaching seat, so Ru Jing sat down, and he swung his whisk around in a circle and said, today, Tian Tong read and turned the great treasury of the sutras for you. And then he got off the teaching seat. So he made the circle and he said, today, Tian Tong read and turned the great treasury of the sutras for you. Oh, and then he threw down his whisk and got down from the seat. It's kind of like, now we go drop the mic. It's sort of like he dropped the mic and got down from the seat. So what Ru Jing did was he drew what's called an enso, or a circle in the air. And it's this circle is the great treasury turning the great treasury. And it is a kind of absolute understanding of the true person or the true master. So the circle is, of course, also completely Ru Jing's circle. And each one of us is going to draw a different circle, right? We draw a circle whether we draw it on the piece of paper, with ink, on fabric, whatever. We draw it in the air. We're going to every one of us has our particular personality and causes and conditions of who we are. And so the question is, does that circle completely manifest who we are? And part of a way of being able to manifest that is that there's a freedom in that. It's unself-conscious, this drawing the circle. So the circle in the air, of course, is very ephemeral. It's without substance. and yet it totally expressed this moment's need. So, was there anything left behind? Did he complete this when he threw it down? Obviously, he felt like he did, and Dogen felt like he did. So that's the story about the whisk. And Dogen did that a lot. In the Eihikoraku, he often ends these talks that he's giving, it short talks, and he'll draw an inso in the air. So a fist indicates something beyond language. So if a dharma, the teacher does this fist thing, it's beyond language and discrimination. It also indicates the person of the true way. It also has to do, I think, with this case, Rinzai in particular is a style. Some Zen masters have a style of actually beating their students, where they hit them or they take a stick and hit them with a stick or whatever. Not advised as a way of teaching. And so then there's the staff. The staff is associated with a guy named Zen Master Daidi. Daidi means strike the ground with your staff. And in the Shiso ceremony, those of you who went and saw the Shiso ceremony, I'm assuming that Cyrus had a staff, right? And he would hit the staff on the ground. So there's probably some connection there with this story about Zen Master Dadi. And he's also often talked about in the same way as the one-fingered, Guido's one finger, because whenever he wanted to make a point, he would just bang his staff on the ground. That's all he would do. So he's famous for that. This is also an attribute of when you get Dharma transmission, you get a long staff, a shorter staff, which is what the Shiso carries, shorter staff, and you get a whisk and a kotsu, which is what we carry that has little tassels on it. So, and then a shout, again, is a device used to shock students into awakening. And also, it's a kind of complete it's verbal, obviously, but non-language response to something like we went to a funeral of a friend of ours, priest, teacher, Kyogen Carlson, and Joe McMullen, who was being the officiant at some point during the funeral ceremony, just let go with this amazing shout that happened during the ceremony. Give you chills. And that was his complete, total expression of his pain, grief, acknowledgement of Kyogen's death. So that's also something that happens, particularly that I've seen it, is at funerals. So the last part of this cannot be understood by discriminative thinking. Indeed, it cannot be fully known by the practicing or realizing of supernatural powers either. So all of these methods and examples are actions or objects associated with the action of the Zen master making this attempt to create awakening for their students. So they're tools, they're methods, and none of them involve a verbal explanation, and they're beyond discriminative thinking. So I think used properly, they shock someone into a kind of awakening. There are other ways that this can be done, but you want to have this kind of direct, non-dual realization of things just as they are. But of course, I think using these methods, especially the violent ones, shouting at people and hitting them and things like that, is certainly not something I'm going to try to do. Because I think for the vast majority of people, that's very much a counterproductive methodology, especially in our culture, and should be avoided. So the Dharma gate to realization is not about superpowers. I think that's one of the points of all of this. This is not about whether you can die standing on your head, whether you can die sitting in zazen posture. It's not about that. It's not about the occult, which these kind of tie into sort of a occult or magical way of being. These special powers that and from Dogen's point of view, has to do with strength and practice. It has to do with our faith in practice and from our daily effort that we make. So that's where we should put our attention. I don't think we need to worry about being enlightened or really being unenlightened. We might worry about being skillful or unskillful, or whether or not our actions are workable or not workable, but we don't have to categorize them as enlightenment or unenlightenment, because I think there's just too much baggage that goes along with those words. So please let us continue our practice sincerely and with deep faith together. Thank you.